avoiding the snake that you step on the scorpion.
Mm-hmm. So that's very good. Could you read a little passage from that book to give us
certainly
a setting for the conversation?
And it's from the beginning, and you'll get a strong sense of why Ursula wants to get involved in this, especially when, if someone dies right in front of you. Ursula had only known Katya for a brief few months since New Year's Eve, but had delighted in being with a strong, independent woman like herself. Katya had arrived in Egypt a week after Ursula and become a welcome ally at the nightly functions and parties, first in Alexandria and later in Cairo. Weary of her business negotiations, Ursula revelled in Katya's love of literature and art. Ursula's presence also seemed to lift the air of melancholy surrounding Katya, as if in each other's presence the pain of the past was forgotten. Ursula gripped the photograph tightly. A wave of nausea swept over her. With Katya's death, the past she had tried to set aside again intruded. She felt the old pain of loss, the old feeling of despair, and a palpable sense of horror that still sickened her. How could it not? Her father's death was never far from her thoughts, and she had been with Katya in the bazaar that day. She had seen Katya die. It was not something to be ignored or forgotten, despite what the Egyptian authorities urged her to do. Katya had been looking for scented oils to take back to England for her sister, and Ursula had accompanied her, eager to procure some attar of roses for herself. When questioned about her sister, Katya responded with a jerk, noting that her husband's disapproval precluded them from maintaining regular contact. Ursula and Katya had decided to forego the fashionable shops in favour of the historic bazaar. They walked along the crowded, narrow passageways, past the vendors sitting atop their mastabas, the stone steps in front of their tiny shops. Katya and Ursula were passing under a vaulted gateway and making their way down the alley when they became separated as a group of young men, clad in long brown cloaks and white turbans, swarmed about them, shouting and calling out in the confusion. At first Ursula was amused. One man's monkey climbed up onto her shoulders and she delighted in placing a ripe date in its tiny paws. Another man waved a tray filled with brass and copper vessels in front of her. Beneath the covered canopy and the projecting windows of the upper floors, with their delicate latticework, the air was dusty and dim. Hazy sunbeams filtered slowly to the ground. Ursula tried to catch a glimpse of Katya, but all she could see were jostling images, flashes of white cloth and dark eyes, and the monkey with its red jewelled waistcoat jumping up and down, clapping its paws. She called out Katya's name and weaved her way between the men, finally catching sight of her amid the tumults and swirling dust. Ursula saw a flutter of concern in Katya's eyes, and she pointed to the monkey with a laugh. Katya's eyes, however, widened with fear. Something, Ursula realised, was terribly wrong. Ursula shrugged the monkey off her back and pushed her way through the crowd. She heard a shrill cry of pain and was seized by panic as she fought to move forward against the noise and chaos. Dust and grit stung her eyes. She was making little headway, for the men were suddenly massed before her like a human wall, their limbs outstretched, torsos rigidly repelling any advance. Ursula called out Katya's name again as she struggled against the men, but she could not see or hear her. Then, as suddenly as they had arrived, the crowd began to disperse. Ursula became disorientated as they scattered about her, shouting and raising their fists into the air. Caught off balance, she stumbled to her knees and her hat fell off. By the time she got to her feet and shook the dust from her skirt, the men had vanished. The laneway was now eerily empty. Even the shopkeepers had left and closed the wooden doors to their stalls. All that remained was a lone donkey boy, his braying charge, and an elderly beggar asleep on the steps of the mosque. Ursula looked around wildly. In her confusion, it took her a few minutes to realise that slumped against one of the wooden stalls was the body of Katya Walensky. At first Ursula thought she had merely fainted, until she saw the bloodstains soaking through her white embroidered dress. And this brought it all back. Her father lying in her arms, his eyes looking up at her as the life left him. At first Ursula couldn't move. The horror of death held her once more in its thrall, and she was powerless. She stood rooted to the ground until a voice within her, with a sudden and terrible calm, urged her to Katya's side. She rushed over and knelt beside the body, listening first for her breath, then laying her trembling fingers against Katya's pale, exposed neck. There was no sound of breath. There was no beat beneath her fingertips. There was only the heat and the taste of sweat upon her lips.